Okay, we're going to open up the floor to questions, but I've asked our panelists. Welcome back, and again, thank you for our panelists. Put our hands together for Fred Naden, Greg Seltzer. What you can think of some questions, but I've asked the two of them to just sort of reflect on some through lines that they've seen in terms of the development of these two technologies. It's very interesting. One is 19th century technology that is still very relevant today. The other is 20th century technology, clearly still relevant today. But they started in different eras, but I think we can see some through lines. So I will maybe Fred, if you would start and talk about some similarities or even some contrasts, and then we'll ask Greg to do the same, and we open it up for questions. And I remind you folks out there in ether, we have a question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. Fred, through lines.
In the beginning, it's for a few people. It's not as fast, but it's faster than everything else.
I'm gonna make sure this is pointed at your face. There you go.
It's expensive. And it's limited. Most places don't have it. In the end, there are many more people. It's even faster, but it's far worse. And more places have it, but there's more delay, even though more places have it. The other thing I notice, and here the parallelism is good, and so I'm going to speak of railroads generally and not publicly owned railroads, which provide transit. In the beginning, there's a period of crony capitalism in which valuable rights are conferred on corporations. Then there's a period of regulation because the corporations are considered to have abused their advantages. Then there's a period of deregulation in which the government is considered to have abused its powers. This didn't happen with public transit. In public transit, there was just a different sequence. After abuse came municipal takeover. This has not happened in the airline industry or the trucking industry or the freight railroad industry. It happened in transit and is thus exceptional.
Greg, any thoughts on through lines you might have seen?
Well, I think Fred did a great job in pointing out some of the similarities just in between of like exclusivity, small scale, expensive, and then expanding, continuing service getting worse, more available to more people, available in more areas. I think another one, it's very obvious with railroads, like the importance of like, since it's, on, under the ground, the importance of infrastructure actually on the ground. This is also really important with aircraft, especially like, obviously now, planes need places to land, but in the early days when they were having to make, I think in studying, flying between France and Southeast Asia, Indochina, which at the time, now is Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, you had to make like 13 stops along the way, and the importance of infrastructure there and having a smoothly functioning ground network, and also like good radio communications and things like that. So just sort of the apparent in both cases the importance of infrastructure, because they had to build airports and then redesign and improve them as the aircraft design improved and aircraft became more powerful. But it's maybe not as evident, not something you think about right offhand with airports and aircraft, but it's very obvious with railroads. It's key, to the whole thing.
Fascinating. Okay, we thank you for those observations. I have some thoughts about public and private, which if I have a chance, I'm going to ask, but I'm going to let Bob Kuykendall ask a question here. Bob.
Yeah, I'm curious about with both of the subways and with airlines in the early years when they were using a lot of passengers. So I don't mean right when it's first developed. How many crashes or deaths or injuries? And was this part of what held it back, or was it so careful at the beginning it sort of moved on and this is a later phenomenon?
No, Fred, you want to?
I haven't made a general check. I only checked the claim that the subway owners, especially the owner of the IRT, Augustus Belmont, made about his railroad in the 20s when he was trying to get a fare hike. Per passenger mile, it was safer than everything else. That's to say deaths per passenger mile. Certainly it was much less safe in the era of the elevated, and it became safer.
Did any of them leave the elevated?
Oh, and I didn't want to be too lurid today, so I skipped those photos.
Wow.
I would say,
Gonna say, Greg.
with aircraft, there were certainly quite a few crashes in the early decades of flying. It's interesting because there's this tension that existed for a time. These people who, were some of these single aviators who were doing these, they were considered daring flights because they were risky. Lindbergh's flight was a huge risk. People were eagerly, awaiting news. They were anxious. It was, to a certain extent, because it was risky and unsafe, for a period of time, and it was single pilots, that's what gave them more of an aura, because they were just doing it, on their own. And there was, to them, from their perspective, and it wasn't just people like Lindbergh or Saint-Exupéry who almost lamented the end of aircraft being so much like an adventure, like it's a risky, like, it's obviously safer than in the First World War, but as they became safer, that, like, from certain aviators' perspective, it became less, I don't know, fun to do. It wasn't, it became less dangerous. The airlines wanted to do that because there's no way that they would be able to carry any people if it was just about crashes, because it was uncomfortable as it was already very uncomfortable flying on these early aircraft. So trying to make it more efficient and safer was a goal, but this also at the same time drove away these, I'm trying to think of what the comparison could be now, like people doing, like, I don't know, like, like when you're just like free rock climbing or something like that, trying to do something like base jumping. I don't know.
Now
like,
you're gonna add ropes, right?
yeah. Yeah.
Maybe that's it. It's interesting too. One of the things about and this reminds me, Greg, you were talking about this really mystique of flying. It could be event even before people were able to really fly. It was already in our imagination, and I think that adds to the particular horror of the airplane crash in our mind, right? I don't know if it's just me, but it seems like a particularly scary idea for a lot of people. Whereas car crashes happen far more often and kill far more people, but there's something about and I wonder if it ties to that mythology of flight, almost like the Icarus, right? It's deeply embedded in us to be afraid of.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it kind of, yeah, I'm sure they did. I mean, naturally it was probably just somewhat easier to hide that information or not make it as public. I mean, what they really wanted to do was like, hey, look at all the stuff you get on a plane. It wasn't like, these crashes, happen with a lot, not like a lot of frequency, but with, they weren't uncommon during the time because, especially flying at low altitudes, so with somewhat rudimentary equipment, and not knowing how to navigate in, poor weather conditions, or even poor, the infrastructure itself is not always reliable. I mean, that's going to cause, each of those increases the factor, or, the chance for, having a fatal crash.
I bet that Hindenburg crashing was good publicity for airplanes. I'm just guessing.
Yeah.
Well, that sort of goes to the question I have, which is you're looking at the subway and you're looking at the airline, but you're not looking at everything else. And the question is it the culture or is it the technology and how they play together? Because with the subway, you have Uber now, and taxis are fighting for their life in New York City, and you have a whole group of people like our children who grew up with certain expectations about transportation and wanting to be able to do what they want to do, when they want to do it, how they want to do it, versus when I came along, I remember when women wore hats and gloves like you showed on airlines.
Mm-hmm.
But you also have, you've not talked about the highway system, the interstate highway system, and the effect that Eisenhower and all of that had on transportation versus the subway. And then my final complexity is the whole culture of it. If you go to Europe, people expect to be communal and travel in crowds, but certainly in today's environment in the US, everybody's me, and I want to do what I want to do, when I want to do it, how I want to do it. So it seems to me it's just much more complicated, and it's been very interesting to look at how each individual one developed, but they were all influenced by things that way beyond them. And so what you have is a wide variety of things, and then you have the whole culture, and then you take the politics and the economics in it.
Added some complexity. Would you like to respond to some of the observations here?
First of all, as concerns fatalities, the Interstate Commerce Commission and its successor, the Civil Aeronautics Board, kept evidently very accurate statistics on deaths, so that we do know how safe forms of transportation are per passenger mile. The cultural question. It is true that in New York, as opposed to other cities I've lived in, people expected to have to take the subway because cabs were expensive and cars were impossible in Manhattan, except for the very rich. So New York had its own set of assumptions about how to get around. When I lived in New Orleans, for example, no such assumptions prevailed. Only tourists and suckers took the streetcar. And other cities might fall in between. But remember that these assumptions, although they're influenced by habit and by the newspapers, they also reflect economic facts. Why, for example, do most American cities not make such assumptions and assume that a car will be used? Whereas in Europe and in New York, no such assumption. There are two reasons. One holds good only for Europe. Gasoline is much more expensive there. The United States subsidizes gasoline far more than any other society in the world. If we want to get serious about you know what, this is the unwelcome place to start. Yank that price up to a British $13. That'll get the people aboard the trains. But aside from that factor, there's the factor of crowding. That's an objective factor. Manhattan is the most crowded large place in America. So these are objective. The cultural factors and the objective factors feed on one another.
It is an interesting point that Margaret had too about though, and it ties to your point too about Greg, this incredible investment in infrastructure, especially the interstate system and forms of global commerce, Malcolm McLaren's development of the container system, all of this. It seemed to, they don't replace each other, but they just added to the complexity of, say, air travel and added to the complexity of this incredible, or travel in general. It's an interesting point. I don't know if there's anything.
Well, I think it's interesting with trains or subways because it seems like there's certain cities, there's actually lament not having some sort of light rail or commuter rail, or there's been some more investment or interest in doing that, even like extending that in Charlotte, for example,
Yes.
even around here. Yeah.
Yes.
Interest in that. And living in, Kylie and I lived in Pittsburgh for a while, and like they have just what a mediocre, what is it, the T or something, what do they call it? It's just, yeah, and it has like 2 stops and traffic is horrible and it's Pittsburgh. You wouldn't expect, you'd think maybe it wouldn't be that awful now, but even getting around like LA, I mean, lamenting places that don't have some sort of established subway, light rail, or again, as it said, like places wanting to, reinvest with that as maybe some sort of, way to, solve or have a better transport solution, or with, gas or anything.
If we're going to believe Elon Musk, there's going to be a giant tube across the country, and we're all going to get in pills and be shot across the country at light speed. But I have a question here. Was it Sam? Do you have a question?
You've been talking about the capital and infrastructure part of this, of these two transportation modes. I'm curious about the labor aspect of it. I remember the last time I was in London, we were going to use the London transport system, the subway, to get us to the airport real quick and then get to the take off on our airplane. But of course, in London, they have labor strikes, transit strikes almost monthly. And in the United States, at least we don't hear that much about them, but it certainly could be influential with the various unions in the airline area and I assume in New York City.
The law for this is as follows. The airlines and the interstate railways are covered by the Railway Labor Act of 1926. This is the law that Biden used to prevent the railroad strike last some 6 months ago. The freight railroads were about to be struck generally. This would have been the first time there had been a long general strike in decades. But he used the law that allows him to impose a settlement with the help of Congress. The subway is governed by a law of New York State, for it is confined to New York State, and it has a similar effect. Fundamentally, railroad and airline strikes are against the law. They're regarded as threats to the state. They take place in Western Europe because there are militant labor unions that have a hostile relationship to the state. I was glad to say that, as I think I implied, that the Transport Workers Union of New York City, Local 100, has a hostile relationship to New York City and state. But in America, this is atypical. Transit strikes are generally rare. New York's had 3 general transit strikes in 40 years. Is it 50 now? And that's unusual. Boston's had none. None.
Greg, could you speak to the big strike that I think of in the airline industry is, of course, the air traffic controllers strike in the early 80s. Can you speak a little bit to labor and was that just to put the kibosh, as you said, there's no strikes or there's very little activity like that. What is the relationship between the unions and these giant corporations, or was that air traffic controller strike that know your place?
I certainly can't speak to that in a lot of detail. I know that, in terms of a marker of labor strikes, that particular strike was, very important in, destabilizing what was already a fluctuating industry at that point in terms of, post-deregulation, all the other issues that were occurring. That particular strike certainly just, added more to the mess. It was causing, as airlines reshuffled. I can't, speak more specifically to just the nature of, labor relations and whether that was just stands out as just being so significant because it was disruptive at the time, and if it's just sort of like you said, a know your place type of instance. I just, that's so. I could, yeah.
Showing the strength of his political movement to shut down
Yeah.
what was a strike. So it was much more than the air traffic controllers. He was making a point, and he could do it because it was federal employees.
Yeah, that's an important point. The role of labor in the airline industry is different because the airports are publicly run and the control system is federally run. On the railroads, all this is private, or if it is public, it is because of municipalization, or in the case of Amtrak, the only case of nationalization. And even in Amtrak's case, although many stations are run by Amtrak and are thus publicly owned the way an airport is, the infrastructure, or I should say the control system that would correspond to the system that is in the hands of the air traffic controllers is an entirely private affair. If you doubt this, think about how you have to change trains in Washington, D.C., because Amtrak's control of the tracks and signals there ends, and from there south, you're in the hands of what I like to think of as the Confederate railroads, such as Norfolk and Southern, which is the railroad, of course, that was responsible for the terrific accident in East Palestine, Ohio.
It's interesting. I wonder about public transportation. We know that there is not a single functioning rail system that's really functioning that people use in the world that's successful, that is not heavily subsidized by the state.
That's correct.
And so I just am curious about, the future going forward in terms of problems. is there a place for public investment in air travel, and is there any opportunity for an expansion of Amtrak to a point that we actually can use trains? I mean, if you look at the train system maps of Europe compared to the train system maps of the United States, it's pathetic. And it's entirely because we've left this in private hands. Is there a public future in the two industries that you, but, and I know I'm asking you to expand beyond the New York City train system in this case.
Would you like to talk first?
Go ahead and take it, Fred.
In the United States, there is a small movement confined to the left, but backed by the Sierra Club and some environmental organizations to nationalize the freight railroads, mainly on the ground that they're unfair, unreliable, but no, on the very different ground that they're smelly, dirty, and among the world's worst polluters when accidents occur. In other words, it's the ecological movement that might link up with the old-fashioned demands for nationalization and lead this industry, if it can be demonized because of its accidents. That's barely possible, although it's only possible if Bernie Sanders wins the election. So it's not very possible.
And, you know, I just don't even see a public face for airlines. Are there public airlines in the world? They get bailouts, right?
Yeah. I don't know if there's any. I certainly can't think of anywhere that's the case. Certainly someone might know that better than me, but.
Do you?
Sure,
Yeah, I'm sure, right? Lufthansa or some of these might have
They were.
ties to the
They
state.
were
right?
originally, yes. Lufthansa
Air
was a public
France,
airline.
Air
Yes.
France, right? Yeah,
Yes,
okay.
yes.
Yeah,
They were. They
Airflow,
were public.
yeah, right? Airflow. Do you have a question?
Well, yeah, sort of. And it's sort of tied to this, I guess. I was thinking there's now some criticism of, mostly from the environmental side, of private airline, like individual private like Learjets and such, and celebrities that fly. And so I was just thinking that, so in the air transportation you have these and cars too, you have these individual private options, but are there any private, like individual options in the train system?
No.
So in some, yeah,
No.
like your own train car. So it's impossible, right? So I thought that was sort of an interesting contrast, because we were talking about like private, public, and I don't know what to make of it. I just thought,
Yeah, FDR, for example, and I wonder what about British prime ministers, but FDR famously had a private car, but he didn't have a private train. He'd hook up his private car to a train operating up in New York or coming down to Washington, and trains were very frequent. And I suppose that the presidents of the railroads, like everyone else, take the plane.
Yeah. Or they, but,
In Europe, there are certainly royal trains. One of the things you may not know that the loyal Dutch people are very upset about is that the Dutch royal train was retired this summer. There is going to be no more Dutch royal train. You'll be glad to hear, though, that by contrast, the Dutch royal jet is still going strong. But the Brits don't have a royal train anymore either.
Right. Well, how did Queen Elizabeth get to Balmoral?
Oh, by royal train. By royal train, because at that time there still was the branch line that went to Ballater, which was not quite all the way to Balmoral, but Queen Victoria didn't want it to go further because then it would be too close to Balmoral. And the last time there was a royal train that went there was in 1964, I think.
You know, there are the individual train options, but they're usually that thing where the two people stand and they go
Yeah,
like
that's
this, you
the-
know? So it's a lot of work, you know. Do we have further questions for our panelists? Yes, Brand. We have about time for one, maybe two more questions.
Both of y'all's presentations had a lot to do with speed or faster, get there quicker. Why in the United States don't we have more bullet trains like Japan and France and China?
To relate to the answer to the previous discussion, government paid for these trains. And in the United States, the government won't pay for these trains. The state of California is trying to pay for these trains, but making a mess of it so far.
I have a question for you, Greg. Drones. Individual drones. Are we in a place where we're going to be Ubering around in drones?
Was there not some? I feel like I've seen something like, not exactly like that, but just with
They're
actual
delivering packages now.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
I haven't actually seen. Is that like common? I actually don't know. I know about it, but I don't know. I certainly hope not. Yeah, I can't.
So we'll just step outside. We won't have airports at all. We'll just step into our little drone and we'll be flown to Los Angeles. I don't know. We're going to end with a mystery here, folks. Listen, I want to let's put our hands together for Greg Seltzer, Fred Naden. Let's thank all of you for coming. I want to remind you, folks, go to humanities.unc.edu to check out our programs. All right, thank you so much for coming, everybody. We'll see you next time.